There are two great responsibilities in politics: to expand and to maintain ground one. The human mind favors those that are gifted in the former, so much so that the latter is neglected. Offensive strategies are associated with purposeful, ambitious, and thrilling actions, whilst defense is found to be a much more stationary, passive, and rote array of procedures. The current American political climate has laid bare that by relying entirely upon our static set of checks and balances, defensive in nature, we enable a great war to be waged and won against progressive policy. This war isn't over, and the front is opening up towards existing policies, with nothing but a small garrison to defend them. Within this blending of critical policies, we come across the popular, yet yawn-inducing Social Security program. You can probably see where I'm headed with this. Social Security, which I will now be using to solely mean old age insurance, as it is colloquially understood by the average American, is not treated with nearly as much interest as, say, climate change, abortion, immigration, and foreign policy. Abortion rights, up until the 2022 Dobbs v. Jackson Supreme Court case, was once part of this collection of neglected positions. This is said to partially substantiate my argument. It would not be inaccurate to compare Social Security to an important yet dreary industrial network under threat of decimation. Social Security will probably find itself in the crosshairs in the near future, possibly as soon as early 2025. The reason behind this involves a solvency crisis, which will emerge in the mid-2030s, urging Congress to act in one way or another as it approaches. It will be prompted to progress or regress as a result. This also isn't the only threat that the program faces. Elon Musk and his Doge team have made passing threats and accusations about the SSA, which may serve as a pretense to alter or impinge upon its administration. Unfortunately, time is running out, and we must act decisively to prepare a defensive strategy to safeguard Social Security. Our strategy demands a series of videos which develops a keen understanding on the history of Social Security, the conditions that brought it about, how it was passed and formed, how it functions today, the sentiment behind it, and the emerging problems that it faces, as well as the efforts to alter it. Progressives must act to defy our current political tendencies, which binds us to an endless cycle of reaction to current events. We must defy it in service to a program that enables the people we love to live dignified lives as aging citizens. Despite what I just stated, I'm not foolish enough to assume that a vague call to arms is enough to peel your attention away from the more exciting political happenings. But the bottom line is that we cannot defend what we do not care about. So I will lay out the case for Social Security. First and foremost, maintaining the ground that Social Security currently covers allows you to collect income necessary to secure your own retirement. With a watered-down version of it, you will struggle to adequately supplement your working income. Secondly, personal interests aside, there is a deeper duty that the program fulfills. That duty involves preserving the dignity of those who will otherwise struggle to do so themselves. Dignity is the state or quality of being worthy of respect. We often perceive dignity to be a self-fulfilled virtue, but it's also a product of nurture and goodwill. Now, why is this the case? Well, it has to do with the fact that certain expressions of dignity are achieved through the support of others. This communal support plays a greater role during one's old age. As one grows older, the ability to act with dignity without the help of others becomes impacted. Dignity is a critical pillar of an individual's sense of self. Our conceptions on what it means to be a citizen are inextricably tethered to ideals of dignified behavior. This behavior is partially maintained through the provision of certain goods, services, and lifestyles. Therefore, financial support in the form of benefits dispensed through old age insurance is offered at a national level to aid in this endeavor. Without support such as this, vulnerable individuals are put into situations where they can no longer maintain their own sense of dignity. Even a slight reduction in benefits would force a noticeably large segment of vulnerable people into abject poverty and homelessness. Which leads me to my third point, that financial insecurity harms far more than the dignity of citizens. It impacts their basic freedoms. Poverty has countless dimensions, which present substantial challenges to the fulfillment of our most basic ideals. Now, you, a reasonable, upstanding human being, may be compelled by these reasons to fight to protect Social Security. It's hard to imagine anyone who would take up arms against a program like this. But I will warn you that there will be no shortage of volunteers who will make Social Security out to be an issue. Their motivations are typical. They benefit from producing an austere version of Social Security. By sparing their abundant income from being taxed, whilst fully insulating themselves from the society-wide consequences, the wealthy further their long-standing goal of creating an America that is beholden to them. I suppose it makes sense to lay out the broad arguments that drive each camp to their respective positions before we delve further down the welfare rabbit hole. Some believe that welfare is a product of our modern appetites, which are spoiled by vice. To this dour camp, the vulnerable are but a few vibe checks away from pulling themselves away from the brink. However, welfare reinforces and preserves one's dalliance with destitution. But if you are at all aware of how programs such as Social Security began, you would know that they draw upon the sober reflection of what our virtues demand. In this more forgiving vein of thought, a man fallen on hard times requires a helping hand to pursue virtue. In the other, he fell into such a predicament through his own vice, and the way to virtue is through a self-reliant endeavor to right oneself. These fundamental positions were carefully discussed during the Enlightenment, culminating in opposing philosophies on how society ought to interact with this dilemma. Out of this development and exchange of philosophy emerged the ancestor of Social Security. It was actually none other than Thomas Paine in his popular yet oft overlooked 1797 treatise, Agrarian Justice, which first toiled with the subject of old age insurance. The treatise specifically discusses stipends to citizens of yearly government-distributed allotments of £15 sterling at 21 and £10 sterling every year after citizens become 50. This is roughly $2,000 in today's currency. Interestingly enough, you could actually buy 2 silver-hilted swords with that amount of money in the late 1700s. Anyways, Agrarian Justice is an exceptional work because it was the first formal articulation of Social Security. The Enlightenment took place during an austere time where a series of poor laws determined a degree of insufficient aid based on worthiness. Paine set the foundational argument for aid towards the elderly. This argument, and all subsequent arguments, reasons that our economic worth is a fundamental pillar of our civil worth, and that the powerful and affluent seek to dishonor and delegitimize this notion. Therefore, Paine is arguing for a positive right to monetary entitlements, to serve as a substitution for such dispossession. His understanding of things is that every person should be born to property. If you can't reap the fruits of your labor in old age from land that should otherwise be yours by natural right, then you are entitled to restitution. To Paine, this involved a lump sum to get yourself started as a young adult and a stipend to maintain your affairs in old age. Unfortunately, Paine was never able to successfully implement this pension plan. You can see the haziness of the argument at hand. Natural land possession is difficult to propose, and the dispossession of this land was equally hard to prove at the time. That all being said, the general themes of destitution and restitution were established, and the spirit of old age insurance was carried forward in some fashion. That spirit rematerialized in odd form during the Civil War as a pension for retired Union veterans. Congress at the time was able to see plainly the duty and subsequent sacrifice of these war-worn elderly soldiers and sought to honor their dignity by providing some level of sustenance. Congress wasn't the only one to recognize this. In addition to veterans' pensions, the first company pensions for retired employees sprung into existence during the late 1800s. It really wasn't until the Great Depression, however, that theoretical and real policy aiming to address the financial insecurity faced by the elderly as a whole started to appear. These policies were proposed at all facets of governance, from the local, state, and national level. Keep in mind that none of these programs were actually implemented. They were merely offered as solutions to the evolving financial problems faced by citizens during this time. Let's begin with the Every Man a King program. First proposed by Louisiana Governor Huey Long, the program aimed to dispense $5,000 a year, about $120,000 to families. In addition, anyone over 60 would receive a pension. Various top tax arrangements were proposed to pay for this plan accordingly. There was also the Ham and Eggs program, which was a tongue-in-cheek name for a Californian-based pension plan, which attempted to provide anyone over 50 $30 every Thursday, which is about $720 every week. Finally, we have the Townsend movement. The Townsend movement was the greatest of the three predecessors of Social Security. It was named after Dr. Francis E. Townsend, who, after witnessing multiple elderly women pick through garbage for food, was compelled to act against the elderly's declining economic state. It actually survived long enough to become a direct competitor of Social Security after members of the House tried to force a vote on it. You could probably see why after learning that it was a national pension where anyone over 60 would receive $200 a month, which is about $4,830 every single month. Compared to what Social Security offered, the Townsend program was much more generous in terms of its proposed benefits. It's worth noting that these were theoretical programs. Each failed in some manner, paving the way for the more modest Social Security Act. We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, though. While these programs certainly lit a fire under the Roosevelt administration's ass to get something passed to protect the elderly, they weren't as critical as one might think. Now, don't get me wrong. Each were important precursors to Social Security, the company veterans pension, and various depression pension plans, but the Social Security Act actually borrowed much of its philosophical justifications and characteristics from the European social insurance movement. Social insurance, and the welfare state as a whole, was first conceived and developed in Prussia with the guidance of Otto von Bismarck as a strategy to develop social liberalism as a bulwark against socialism. It broadly refers to a set of policies that are meant to realize the insurance principle, where certain groups of people are insulated or protected from defined risks. The insurance principle is itself molded by broad social objectives, as opposed to individual gain. The original blueprint of social insurance was one where policies such as old age pensions constituted one of three major pillars of the whole concept. The old age pension, as it is referred to by historians, reflected about 18% of the average worker's wage in Prussia. One half was paid by the employer and the other half was paid by the employees. It also included widows and disability pensions, which involved similar distribution amounts. Due to the lower life expectancy faced by mid to late 19th century Germans, only about 1 in 200 received this pension. Despite its antiquated and limited nature, the OAP, along with alternative European social insurance programs, provided a national framework for the US to draw from. In addition, its fundamental principles were tested by each corresponding electorate, and each policy stood the test of time. Men like Abraham Epstein actually recognized this before the Great Depression and had begun forming organizations to lobby Congress for its implementation. It makes sense why this was the case. Epstein and many of the early supporters of an American social insurance program were European or from culturally European nations. They understood that the fundamental principles of social insurance were tested by each corresponding electorate, and each policy stood the test of time. Just like the previous iterations of social insurance, Social Security wasn't implemented at the height of prosperity in the US. Rather, it was put into practice as a result of heightened economic insecurity experienced during the Great Depression. The Depression was economically devastating to most Americans, but the elderly population suffered especially. Over half of the elderly population in the US lacked enough income to be self-sufficient. Our old structures of support that were drawn from by our elders, the family, and charity networks were pushed to their absolute breaking points. Family abandonment by breadwinners was an epidemic, and the most vulnerable members of the family were left in the lurch. At first, the elderly assumed that they would have to get back to work and ventured once again into the labor market, but soon found extreme difficulty in securing a job. They were faced with the age-old maxim about old age, that it saps the vigor of youth, efficiency, sharpness, malleability, factors that employers look for in their subordinates, diminishes in old age. Poverty, as a result, becomes a much greater burden to bear. It's worth further examining this notion of old age, because it contains an undercurrent which greatly imperiled the situation of the senior population. That is, the role that ageism played in denying and isolating the elderly from self-sustaining positions. Ageism, which is still rife in today's modern world, coalesced during the Depression to deny employment to many elders who were driven out of retirement to unsuccessfully beg for their former jobs. From the jump, things were already dire for the US at the time. The unemployment rate rose to 25%, leading to a much more competitive labor market. The stock market lost over 80% of its value, tightening hiring budgets, and 7,000 banks failed, which stalled necessary funding for commercial expansion, wiping out a ludicrous amount of wealth in the process. Finally, prices deflated significantly, which subsequently deflated profits as a result. This led to the perfect economic storm, where investment plummeted, company liquidity disappeared when their cash vanished along with the banks that were supposed to safekeep it, liabilities became due earlier than normal, and demand for certain goods and services decreased by double digits. As a result, these companies viewed that there was no room to retain or hire older workers. Self-preservation certainly does not encourage generous outlooks towards others, especially when it comes to the disabled, the young, and elderly. A Congressional Research Service study conducted by Linda Levine, a labor specialist, found that many older workers struggled to find new jobs due to age discrimination. Since age discrimination wasn't illegal, employers made the choice to hire younger laborers who were considered more proficient in the more modern skills and adaptable in the face of changing times. Some firms even went as far as to implement age restriction policies, barring laborers as young as 45 years old. Simply put, older men were replaced by younger laborers due to being seen as less productive. Not only were they replaced by younger laborers, but they suffered exceptionally more due to technological developments. Obviously, the explosion of heavy machinery equipment and factory lines posed an additional threat to menial labor roles, which were partially composed of elderly laborers. Now, it's worth pausing to acknowledge that ageism, like many other forms of bigotry, begins with the general application of stereotypes to a population. We often view elderly citizens as slow, delicate, stuck in their ways, and grumpy. Unlike other forms of bigotry, however, these characteristics draw upon a mostly physiological basis rather than a cultural one. It is certainly true that old age brings many challenges that mostly have to do with declines in physical and mental health, stemming from the aging process. Mentally speaking, as one ages, hippocampus size decreases, affecting short-term and long-term memory. The myelin sheaths that protect nerve fibers erodes, diminishing neural connectivity, coordination, and movement. Finally, old age brings a heightened risk of neurological conditions such as dementia and Alzheimer's. The brain in old age doesn't entirely diminish in capability, however. Distant regions of the brain become better connected as dendrite branching increases. Physically speaking, though, the symptoms of aging are even more pronounced. Our blood vessels and arteries stiffen, causing more strain in the heart. Muscles weaken and become inflexible. Joints and bones shrink in size and density, making them brittle. Finally, ailments such as arthritis lessens dexterity. Deficits in both physical and mental activity combine to potentially impair the laboriousness of elderly citizens. These deficits play out in the labor market by impacting productivity.
Even if an increased number of persons from the cohort 55 to 64 years were inserted on the labor market, they cannot achieve a higher productivity, possibly due to garnered experience during their active life, depreciation of knowledge and comprehension, and also due to manifold tendencies in mental and physical performance.
The elderly aren't a monolith when it comes to health and ingenuity, though. There are many who remain spry and able-bodied, as well as quick-witted, up until the end of their lives. Also, plenty of occupations which accommodate various declines in health exist. However, the reality of things is that ageism plays a rather significant role in hiring practices, and these biases rear their ugly heads, leading to a truly catastrophic consequence in times of economic hardship. A recent 2022 meta-analysis titled Age and Workplace Ageism showed that an increase in workers' age had a significant negative association with the severity of their workplace-based ageist attitudes. Even in today's forward-thinking world, where discrimination based on age has been prohibited, ageism is still common. elderly citizens have to navigate through the challenges of their own diminishing capabilities, whilst weighing it against a culture that is eager to seize upon any whiff of them. There is certainly something to be said about the capacity to labor, and whether one is fit for a certain station in society based on their diminishing performance. But it's important to draw a line where we say there is nothing wrong with a seemingly healthy elder participating in society to the fullest extent possible. The Great Depression, however, saw that final sentiment thrown fully out the window. Ageism truly reared its ugly head during this time. Without access to gainful employment or economic support, destitution among the elderly became inevitable. Many elderly men were cast out to live in the countless Hoovervilles or homeless encampments that dotted the U.S. landscape. While substantial records weren't kept about the homeless population at the time of the Depression, it was estimated that roughly 2 million people were homeless. Senior citizens aside, the families that did not abandon their older folks were left with a difficult task of providing for them at a time where they struggled to feed their own children.
Children, friends, and relatives have borne and still carry the major cost of supporting the aged. Several of the state surveys have disclosed that from 30% to 50% of the people over 65 years of age were being supported in this way. During the present depression, this burden has become unbearable for many of the children, with the result that the number of old people dependent upon public or private charity has greatly increased.
A crippled job market, crumbling support networks, competition with more youthful laborers, diminishing labor capabilities, combined with the virulent belief that the elderly are infirm, led to millions of senior-age Americans facing dire economic straits. This is where Social Security came into the picture, as a bulwark against the externalities of capitalism. As stated in the brief authored by Justice Cardozo in the landmark case Helvering v. Davis, which decided the constitutionality of old age insurance,
Congress did not improvise a judgment when it found that the award of old age benefits would be conducive to the general welfare.
But the thing is, how exactly did Congress get to that judgment? The situation that is fast approaching will take place in Congress, won't it? Surely we can look to that first legislative battle that kicked things off. Perhaps we can glean some insight on that process as well. Maybe even scrounge up some details on the implementation of the program. God knows with what the Trump administration and DOJ is doing, that wouldn't hurt. So, why not spend some time familiarizing ourselves with those details? The best first-hand source we have of the implementation of Social Security was Arthur J. Altmeier's book, The Formative Years of Social Security. Altmaier was a key figure in the original Committee on Economic Security and the Assistant Secretary of Labor in the newly elected Roosevelt administration. He, along with Edwin E. Witt, are considered to be the two fathers of Social Security. They both oversaw its planning and implementation. As we stated before, Social Security was a descendant of a lineage of social insurance programs. Its underlying philosophy came to be considered through the first-hand experiences of countless Americans. It was especially of key importance to high-ranking progressives and intellectuals. The bottom line with the Social Security Act was that it served as a compromise program. This program had two major ends in mind: to deliver economic security to the elderly and stave off panacea, such as the Townsend Act. Regardless of its less than idyllic beginnings, Altmaier explicitly states that it only came to pass due to certain unique circumstances. Those circumstances were an economic depression, combined with a sympathetic administration and a beleaguered Congress. But it was specifically Franklin D. Roosevelt, his Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, and Harry Hopkin, a key administrator of the Federal Emergency Relief Program, that channeled the years of desperation and the stalwart will to be dutiful to the American people into the seed that bore Social Security. Social Security, formerly known as Executive Order number 6757, didn't just appear out of thin air from that moment. Detailed steps had to be taken to secure the program. The Roosevelt administration took those first steps by creating the Committee on Economic Security, which we will now refer to as CES. Consisting of a handful of the administration's key cabinet members, along with Altmaier and Witt as executive director, the committee had less than 6 months to make its recommendations to Congress. All involved, including FDR himself, were ardent believers in social insurance. They first set out to distinguish Social Security from its competitors, such as the Townshend Act or Every Man a King platform. This was done by aligning Social Security with the traditional Prussian model, which favored a contributory funding base rather than a general taxation base. To FDR, this detail truly mattered, because he viewed contributory funding to be a safeguard against future attacks. Instead of funds being redirected from general tax revenues, contributions in the form of FICA taxes provided a more direct connection between Social Security and the taxpayer. Another important characteristic of Social Security was that the level of federal and state cooperation employed to enable the function of the program was unprecedented. Within this tidbit of knowledge is a key lesson that I think that progressives need to relearn. We're always tripping over ourselves to produce a program that is purely federal when it comes to its administration. But New Deal Democrats were interested in a platform maximized for the consent and health of states. These characteristics put together paint a picture of a group of experts who were keenly aware of the hurdles that Social Security faced. We like to assume that because a program is seemingly benevolent, that it is automatically constitutional, or that its administration is feasible. As I also stated before, there's this assumption among progressives that the New Deal era was a time of effortless success. The truth of the matter is that the New Dealers were actually notoriously detailed in strategic political force. They understood that Congress wasn't as sympathetic to their cause as they outwardly seemed, and were constantly politicking to curry favor among congressional figures. These challenges put together would probably make a modern politician shrivel up and grow, but it really pales in comparison to the issues posed with conceiving and ensuring the technical components of Social Security actually work. Sure, we can make the program constitutional and doll it up for Congress, even work out its administration. But none of that matters if the program can't collect contributions from taxpayers, estimate benefits, dispense them, and ensure they can continue to be dispensed. Each of these four broad functions requires an incredible level of detail, and each detail is further constrained by the previously mentioned challenges. For these reasons, old age insurance and unemployment were of the greatest concern to the CES. As a result, the committee quickly set out to draft a recommendation of an omnibus bill, including old age, unemployment, and disability insurance, to be sent to the Ways and Means Committee within the House of Representatives. The drafting process was where much of the heavy lifting for Social Security was accomplished. Luckily, a lot of the technical details of old age insurance were ironed out as unemployment insurance was conceived. During the debate on how to facilitate unemployment insurance, the committee arrived at the general scheme they wanted to utilize for contributory taxation, which was a split of funding between employers and employees. Unemployment insurance is actually solely funded by employers, save for a few states. Still, this debate on funding by the committee went a long way in building out the other parts of the Social Security Act. When the committee's attention eventually turned to the economic issues faced by the elderly, they came up with two broad strategies. Strategy 1 was meant to alleviate the burden on citizens who were currently elderly. It involved a series of federal grants to states that provided public assistance to the unemployed, with the elderly being a major recipient. The second and more ambitious of the two was old age insurance for the future elderly. The combination of these two provided short and long-term policy that addressed poverty among the elderly of current and future generations. In tandem with building out these strategies was the consideration of some of the key issues that Social Security would face in the future, chief among them when contributions do not cover the mandated allotment of benefits. Altmaier and his peers quickly determined that a possible deficit in old age insurance would begin in 1965 and reported this to FDR himself. They feared a future where Social Security would be supplemented out of general revenues. To be clear, the committee did not provide insight into the solution to solvency issues, but they indirectly provided their own thoughts, which ought to be taken into consideration as its modern problems mount. That is, the committees and FDR himself viewed that Social Security has to be completely sustained through employer and employee contributions. The initial contribution for Social Security was a 2% split between employers and employees. Today, that rate is a combined 12.4%. This was to create an adequate reserve of $47 billion as a mechanism to ensure that claims could be paid off during extraordinary times, like the Great Depression or recession. Now, I urge you to think about this measure carefully. The purpose of this surplus was to develop a cushion for economically turbulent times. I will elaborate further on this slow reversal of the surplus to an eventual deficit in modern times, but keep this part in mind for now. A surplus such as this may be considered pragmatic, even wise to progressives such as ourselves, but it wasn't taken lightly by employers. Simply put, business owners assumed that it would be a burden on their depression-addled operations. These specific qualms were partly the root cause of the conservative congressional opposition at the time. To be honest, though, when the omnibus bill eventually reached the House floor, there was certainly opposition, but most of it was coming from the progressive side of the aisle. Congressional figures who were either themselves Townsendites or sympathetic with the cause staged a final effort with Dr. Townsend himself to kill the old age insurance portion of the Social Security Act. Now, I probably don't need to clue you in on the reason why this was done. They viewed the CES recommendation as a watered-down version of their own preferred program. Opposition was eventually quelled from the moderate contingent of Congress through a quid pro quo to sacrifice a volunteer old age annuity feature facilitated by the Treasury. Furthermore, Congress wanted states to be in charge of hiring employees to work in the new Social Security Administration. Opposition to the bill didn't fully dissipate, however. When the bill made it past the Ways and Means Committee, it faced unanimous opposition from the Republican members of the committee. This is where the employer-directed assault comes back into play. Republicans viewed the old age insurance specifically as a
crushing burden upon industry and labor, a direct contributor to the deepening of federal bureaucracy.
Another point that they made was that the program would destroy private old age retirement systems. Conveniently missing from these talking points was the severity of the situation faced by the elderly population, which congressional Republicans were merely omitting due to their long-held subservience to business. Just as a quick aside, it's not that they view, in this particular case, that business should be left be. It is that in many cases, save for a few, business ought to be spared from government interference. These criticisms still appear today from Republicans, hidden behind a very thin veil of fiscal responsibility. In its theoretical form, fiscal responsibility isn't an intrinsically faulty concept, but uttered from the lips of Republicans, it serves more as a dog whistle for extreme austerity deployed with the aim of crippling public programs. This observation isn't some baseless extrapolation dug up from a single morsel of information. You can find many more similar refrains found in modern times just in this one case alone. For example, when the bill was eventually handed off to the Senate on April 19th after a House vote, it encountered another wave of resistance best summarized in the following allegation: that Social Security is actually socialism. To be frank, this doesn't really warrant an intelligently thought-out counter-argument. If we were forced to eloquently dismiss every Republican allegation about the program, we would be here forever. Partially or fully socializing one industry based on the individual merits isn't akin to a sweeping ideological position that all of the means of production need to be socialized, which is the chief mandate of socialism. Social Security doesn't even come close to partially socializing the retirement savings industry, which is really a segment of the much larger financial services industry. We still have pensions and individual retirement accounts. Even if we take the Social Security Act wholesale, unemployment, disability insurance, and even some forms of retirement insurance still meaningfully exist in the private market. Now, you could say that the senators and House members opposing the SSA did not have the hindsight that we have to utterly dismiss their claims, but the proof is in the pudding. Even a preliminary scan of the omnibus bill would have utterly decimated this notion, because an array of guardrails were drafted to ensure the existence of a meaningful market element for these insurances. The one hint of overreach, which had to do with Treasury annuities being offered through the SSA, was unceremoniously removed from the program, which goes to show how much consideration the CES had towards the market. Getting back to the subject at hand, after the subsequent denial of any new amendments as a response to these frivolous claims, and the removal of one amendment, which involved the independence of the Social Security Board, the Senate Finance Committee recommended the bill for passage on May 20th. On June 14th, the Social Security Act, including unemployment, limited disability, and old age insurance, was passed by a vote of 77-6 in the Senate. The House was then tasked to vote on the updated omnibus bill, restoring the amendments on the independence of the Social Security Board. It was then sent back to the Senate and then the President's desk, ultimately passing on August 14th, 1935. Now, I know that I said before that we lack a nuanced understanding of New Deal politics, but this bill, which is probably the most influential progressive bill in modern history, was passed with much greater ease compared to its modern counterparts. But just because we won something relatively easily doesn't mean that we can keep it as such, especially in non-ideal circumstances. The Republican dissent towards this bill didn't magically dissipate after the ink dried. Keep in mind that disapproval towards Social Security partially emanates from a broader ideological position, rather than specific qualms towards the particulars of the bill. Trying to follow the reasons for dissent up the river is going to lead you to a much greater source of discontent. If you're curious, you can go down the long rabbit hole of critical articles, think pieces, and papers issued by conservative-leaning assets that have cropped up over the years. We're actually going to discuss this aspect of discontent a bit during the next video. But much of these pieces materialize specifically in opposition to the functioning of Social Security. So to really understand these criticisms, we'll have to take into account the functioning of the program itself. Planning of the administration and function of the SSA didn't begin until October 16, 1935. Initially, the board consisted of merely 3 chairmen. Arthur Altmeyer, the author, was one of the 3 members, eventually becoming the first chairman in 1936. In addition, an executive director and 8 bureau chiefs were appointed. Each were allowed to select but not appoint their own staff. Separating the selection and appointment was meant to ensure that Congress had some level of control over the hiring within the administration. Now, their reasons weren't as noble as you would think. Congressional figures pretty much wanted a leeway to strong-arm the board and chiefs into selecting their lackeys. The bottom line was that the Social Security Act was an incredibly unique policy. The scale of cooperation between states and the federal government was unprecedented. You could bet your top dollar that Congress wanted in on the action, either to exercise authority so that they could pacify their power-hungry egos, to deliver on political favors for loyal staff, or offload their unwanted aides on Altmeyer. This is really a noteworthy point to take into account. It may give the more savvy members of the current and upcoming Congress some pause before they vote to gut Social Security. The reason being that it would simultaneously remove an avenue of developing their political influence. There are many former aides to top Republicans and Democrats within the SSA right as we speak. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that this is just another corrupt manifestation of our current political climate, with dogmatists sitting in every cubicle. Altmeyer speaks very plainly that the success of the Social Security Administration was due to its initial and long practice habit of hiring on a non-political basis. This is still a fundamental pillar of the SSA, as evidenced in its faithful execution of responsibilities and stewardship of the program. The initial staffing of the SSA offers a great lesson in how to ensure a program's success. Individuals well versed in the technical background of policy relating to social insurance were hired first. Obviously, before you get to dispensing benefits, you need people who know how to develop social insurance policies. You're also going to want people who can advise the various state governments on how to best facilitate this policy and coordinate it with the federal government. This culminated in a set of truly groundbreaking policies, unheard of in terms of its scale and nature in the US. Instead of sporadic, optional, inadequate public assistance, Social Security was a program that dispensed money payments based on a legal right to assistance. Now, for the sake of time, I can't go too deeply into the nuts and bolts on how Social Security was built out. When it comes to the actual workings of modern Social Security, the formative years of Social Security becomes a bit outdated. Since it was published in the late 1960s, it doesn't include the various amendments made to Social Security, which have altered it throughout the years. The program has evolved and changed over time. Therefore, it's simply better to base our understanding of the program on up-to-date information. So how exactly does Social Security work? And how can we leverage our knowledge of its function and our strategy to defend it? The entirety of the next video will be dedicated to such a topic. I always find it prudent to give you all the time to actually digest the information before we carry on. I really hope you enjoyed what I had to offer. There's so much more to come, and as always, feel free to subscribe, like, and comment. It helps out a ton. I'll see you soon, everyone.